Estamos aqui na livraria Ler Devagar com o especialista em storytelling Doug Stevenson. O Doug é norte-americano, eu tenho a sorte de conhecer o Doug há alguns anos, é meu mentor e foi com muito gosto que soube que ele vinha a Portugal da primeira vez. Esta é a segunda que está cá. Veio desde a primeira vez trabalhar com algumas empresas portuguesas e no fundo sensibilizar e acima de tudo ensinar esta arte que é o storytelling. Neste mundo caótico em que nós vivemos, em que temos toneladas de informação e dezenas de estímulos quase ao minuto, é importante ter a certeza que captamos a atenção e o interesse das nossas audiências. E as nossas audiências pode ser uma pessoa numa sala de reunião, os nossos colaboradores, pode ser clientes, podem ser parceiros, e neste mundo caótico em que vivemos, voltar a técnicas ancestrais de comunicação começa a ser uma boa solução. Por isso, convidei o Doug para esta conversa. Doug, hello. Welcome. It's really good to have you here, and it's an opportunity to share your knowledge and share years and years of experience that you have in this area. So what would you say to the Portuguese people who are listening and seeing us at this point? Who's Doug?
It's a pleasure to be here with you, Carla. Here we are in a lovely library in Lisbon, in the LX Factory area. Historic area, stories all around us. All of these books are filled with stories of human interaction and human drama. And each and every one of us has stories from our life where we've learned things and experienced things. And of course, you and I both, as presenters, as storytellers, we are mining our lives for these stories. And whether I'm in Lisbon or in Auckland, New Zealand, or in Tokyo or in Bogota, it doesn't matter where I go, story is the universal language. It is a language that we all speak because it is the language of the body, it is the language of the mind, it is the language of the heart. And wherever I go, I can tell the same stories and the audience responds, even though I might be speaking in English and it's not their first language. And so the beauty of storytelling is that no matter what part of your organization you work in, whether you're speaking internally or externally, everyone loves a good story.
Yeah.
The question is, do you use that tool well? Do you understand strategically how to choose and craft and tell a story that fits that moment in time?
Yeah, I think we have a lot to learn with you. But when did you decide in your life, how did you get to decide that you wanted to be a storyteller, and how did you become a master in this art?
It's a fascinating story. My journey started out many years ago, back in 1972, when I hitchhiked to Hollywood to be in the movies. And I dedicated a good part of my life to being an actor. And what I was doing as an actor was living inside of someone's story. Someone had created a story and I played a part in that story. And when I realized that acting wasn't going to be the form that I was going to have a success in, and I left Hollywood, I started to discover that there was this profession called professional speaking, that people made a living giving speeches on change and leadership and diversity and cultural issues. And I thought, well, that's for me. I want to be at the front of the room like that. I want to be the star of the show. I want to be up there giving keynotes. And well, what I ended up doing is telling stories, because that's what you do, you tell stories. Well, over a period of time, I discovered that I had a unique combination of acting and narrative storytelling that I had blended together into this hybrid. And over a period of time, people said, could you teach me how to do what you're doing? I've never seen someone do something like that. The acting within the storytelling, the present and the past tense. And so I started teaching it, and voila, all of a sudden here I am, 23 years later, having taught storytelling all over the world, having learned how to integrate it into a business context so that a leader can inspire or motivate or explain why we're going through this change. A marketer could help communicate the brand message to someone. An engineer could actually explain the technology to someone in terms that they could understand. And so it's been an evolution, as all of our stories are.
You make it simple, and this is great because companies where you go to, they have people who have other affairs, like they run marketing departments. They don't have time to think about stories. How can people from companies who know almost nothing about storytelling can be great storytellers.
Let's start with a premise.
Yeah.
Logic explains, stories persuade. Many people are skeptical of the need for storytelling in a business context, especially people who have a lot of content, a lot of data, a lot of explaining to do. And they think, well, why should I tell a story? Isn't that a waste of time? Wouldn't that be a distraction? Wouldn't people get bored? Why don't I just explain what it is that I want to say? And the problem with explaining things is that when you explain something very well using your logic, the person listening to you understands using their logic, which may not be the same.
Yeah.
And so when you've explained it, they might say, yes, I understand. And what they're not saying is, I'm not going to buy what you're selling. I don't really care about what you're saying. I understand it intellectually, but emotionally I haven't bought into it. I'm not convinced that I should change my behavior, change my thought process. So logic explains, stories persuade. The reason we use stories is stories are mental, emotional, spiritual, they're auditory, visual, kinesthetic. They touch every part of a human experience in a way that logic does not. And so the challenge is, your logic is not my logic. And if you explain it using your logic and expect me to go along with that, I might say, yes, I understand. No, I don't want it.
Yeah. Let me ask you something. It's a technique, storytelling, it's a technique that has thousands of years, but somehow at some point in the human history, we just stopped telling stories to each other as we used to do. So why did that happen? Do you have any idea on that?
Well, business is very complex. You and I will all tell stories when we leave work. We'll tell stories at a birthday party, we'll tell stories at dinner with friends, having drinks at a barbecue. We'll tell stories all the time in a social environment without thinking of it, because that is how we communicate what's going on in our lives. But in a business context, business is so complex. The products, the services, the details of what's going on is so complex that people get lost in trying to explain what's going on. How does this work? How? And what people need to understand is, why is this going on? Stories tell why.
Yeah.
Stories create context for content. And in a business context, we've gotten so lost into the content, the details of our product, of our service, and how it works and why you should buy it, that we've lost the story of the human reason why this would be important. And stories bring the humanity back to the business proposition.
And now we know the why. Let's talk about the how, because I have too many clients who ask me, they say, I'm not a storyteller, I don't tell stories at all. So how can these people that have their jobs and their responsibilities, how can they just take a piece of their time to craft this technique?
First, we have to identify, what do I need a story for? And an analogy that I would use is, you have a project around the house. So something needs fixing around the house. So the first thing you do is you say, well, what needs fixing? And then you say, well, what tools do I need to fix it? And then you say, well, what equipment do I need to buy if I don't have the right equipment? And so you assess what I need a story for. What do you want to communicate? Do you need people to buy into a change? Do you need to sell a product or service? Do you need to brand your product in a different way, communicate a new brand story? So we assess what it is that we need a story for, and then we go looking for the story. And so the way that I start with this is I say, where in your life have you had an experience that explains in a story form what you're trying to teach me in a business way? In other words, a change is going on in the organization, people are resistant to this change. Where have you in your life ever been resistant to change? Tell me the story of where you in your life were resistant to change and how you learned that resisting change was futile, it didn't work, and you eventually got better at changing, and use that personal story, and then you bridge it over into the business context at the end of the story in a way that people think, oh, you were just telling me a story about your life, and where you were like, you didn't want to change and everything. Is like, oh, that has to do with what's going on here in our business. So the story distracts, goes off on a detour, but then comes right on back to the business point, and that's where everybody goes, Oh.
And it shows the purpose.
And it shows the purpose, and it makes sense.
Let's talk about the process, because you've said we have to search for our stories, like our inner Google, right? How does it work, that process of how do I go and look for stories that are related to some points that I want to make if I don't have my memory is not clear enough, and when we pressure we cannot find the stories. Is that a process that you use in your training sessions?
The process that I use for finding stories, and this is where most people do get stuck, so it's a very important question. How do I find a story? You start by looking at your life and saying, where did I encounter an obstacle or a challenge? A small disaster, a big disaster, a crisis, a misunderstanding. We look for those moments in our life when there was a crisis or an obstacle where we learned a lesson from that. Because you and I, and everyone listening to this interview, we've all had all of these experiences in our life where things did not go according to plan.
Yeah, for sure.
And at the moment we thought, oh no, this is bad, this is terrible, I don't want it to go this way. But over a period of time we realize, you know, when change happens, sometimes things work out better. When something doesn't go according to plan, I use my resources to figure out a new solution. Story is about encountering an obstacle, figuring out a new solution, and having a new thought process or a new behavior. And so what we're looking for is to catalog all those moments in our life where we've had all of these different obstacles, challenges, crisis, misunderstandings. Now we look at those and we say, okay, I've got this story and this story and this story and this story. What's the point? What is the lesson here, and how does it apply to my business proposition? What is the lesson of that one? So I start out with, I've got all of these stories, what's the point? Does the point relate? Sometimes I start the other way. I start with what is the problem, and I need a story for that. So I go in the opposite direction. I go, okay, we need to get people to understand why this technology instead of another technology. So we're always trying to find the stories from our own personal life, matching them to the business proposition, finding the point with a phrase that pays, and then moving forward.
And that's a point I want to see with you. Doug has this method, it's the storytelling theater method, 9 steps. And maybe you can talk briefly about the 9 steps, but then I would like you to talk about that part, the phrase that pays, that I love it, and you will love it too.
One of the most powerful lessons that I teach is the phrase that pays. Now, when we go to the movies, when we are listening to a speech, when we are looking at advertising, quite often they use this concept of phrase that pays. Make my day. Look for the limo. Use the force. So in movies, there's always these phrases like from Jerry Maguire, show me the money. So there's these phrases that seem to echo and last in our mind.
Like, yes, we can.
Yes, we can. All of these, business slogans and political slogans, they try and find a phrase that pays, which is a verb-oriented call to action phrase. Now, what I do with story is I use this 9 steps of story process that I've created, which is basically instructions for how do you craft a story. Because that's the challenge most people face is, okay, I've identified a story, but I don't know how to craft it. I don't know what to do with it. I'm a terrible storyteller. The 9 steps of story structure that I've created allows people to follow this template of this sequence of 9 steps. And at the end, you use this phrase that pays. What I learned from that experience was use the force.
Yeah. Can you tell us about the 9 steps method?
The 9 steps of story structure. Basically, all stories follow a pretty similar structure. The main character, somebody sets off on a journey to accomplish something. Along the way, they encounter obstacles, they find allies, they learn lessons from overcoming the obstacles, and life is better at the end of the day. I've taken that process and I've said, okay, how does it work when you go to a movie? How does it work when somebody's telling a story that really works? Step 1, you set the scene. Time and place. All stories start at a specific moment in time, a time and place. Here we are in Lisbon, January 8th, Lisbon, a library. So there's a scene that you start out with, a time and a place. Then you move off into the journey. What is the journey? What are you trying to accomplish? Along the way you encounter characters. So one of the steps is Introduce the characters. Don't just say my boss, introduce them. Give me some descriptors. And now we encounter the obstacle. Step 4, encounter the obstacle. Oh, something goes wrong. There's a problem. There's an antagonist. Something happened that wasn't supposed to happen. Step 5, overcome the obstacle. What did you do? How did you overcome the obstacle? What choices did you make? What thoughts did you have? What reactions did you have? Step 7, resolve the story. How did things work out? How did they work out? Did everything work out okay? Step 8, make the point. One clear and concise point. Step 9, ask the question. Well, how about you? Have you ever been in a situation like that? So these steps that you go through are basically a template, a sequence, and if you use that sequence, you can craft any story in a very quick and simple way to come to a conclusion that is very satisfying for the listener, and then you end with a phrase that pays, a call to action.
I have a question related to the dimension of the story. Many people tell me, I'm not an Olympic athlete, I don't have a big life, I don't do huge things. Does it have to be a big story?
That's a fabulous question, because the challenge a lot of people have is they go and they see a motivational speaker, and they get up there and they're Olympic athletes who've done amazing things, or people who've climbed Mount Everest and almost died. And I've coached about 6 people who've climbed Mount Everest, and I kept thinking, what is your problem? You're going to die up there, for crying out loud. And yet, when it comes to storytelling, I've made a career out of telling stories and teaching stories, and I have no big life-threatening anything. One of my most popular stories is a story about learning how to give my dog who is sick a pill. Now, whenever I tell this story, everybody's like, oh, I have a dog, oh, I know, and they all relate to it, and they all nod, and it's like, and here I am telling a story about learning how to give my dog a pill and learning a lesson from that. That if you want to give a dog a pill, you need to hide the pill in the peanut butter. And everybody thinks, well, so what? I mean, what does that got to do with business? Well, but in business, quite often, presentations are way too much pill, way too much data, way too much science, way too much content. The pill is good medicine, but it's too much and it's too hard to swallow. Oh, it's too much medicine, it's too much data, it's too much science, it's too hard to swallow. So what do you need to do? You need to hide the pill in the story butter. The peanut butter represents story because peanut butter is sticky. So now I tell a story about giving my dog a pill, and using the analogy of the pill is this and the peanut butter is story, and I hide the pill in the peanut butter, and everybody's like, oh. But if they go home, they think, that was a nothing story. That was a nothing. That was about giving a dog a pill. That's nothing. There was no life-threatening nothing. What was it? It was craft. It was understanding how to use an ordinary, common experience to make a profound business lesson. And that's what I teach. And that's where people need your help and my help to be able to figure out, okay, we want to tell stories. Help me.
We won't leave this interview. This interview won't be finished until Doug tells us a story. Okay, pick one. But in the meantime, I would like you to talk to the Portuguese people who are listening to us. You have been working with some Portuguese companies. What have you found? Is there any Portuguese approach to storytelling?
Well, I love working in Portugal because the people are so friendly, they're so warm, they're so open and receptive. However, there are always the skeptics. So in one of the bookings that we did the last time I was here, I was in a room full of about 80 people, a technology company, and I'm teaching storytelling. And it's a mixture of everybody in the company, from HR and leaders and engineers and software developers, and everybody's in the room together. We're all doing storytelling. And I could see that a lot of the people are like, okay, this is fun, let's learn this. But I could see this one guy, and he was just like not into it. He's just not buying this at all. And at the first break, I went up to him and I said, so what's going on? You seem to be kind of resistant. And he says, well, I'm a software engineer. I don't get this whole thing about stories. I don't understand why I would need stories. And as I went through the day explaining the science of story, how it works on the brain, how the brain sees in pictures and remembers things in pictures, and how stories place content in context. Over a period of time, he started to warm to the idea. He started to intellectually understand why story is a good fit for what he does as a software engineer, because he's got to explain his engineer, his HTML, his stuff to non-engineers. Yeah. And he'd always had a problem explaining it in his language to somebody else. Well, after a while, we're doing these exercises, and I'm watching him, and he's kind of getting into it a little bit. And at lunchtime, he came up to me and he said, Doug, I want to talk to you a second. I get it now. I get it now. I didn't believe it. Now I believe it. Now I get it. I understand why I need to use a story. That, in a nutshell, is Portugal. All of the people, different personalities, but that is a common experience that I have in the United States, in Atlanta or Dallas, in Lisbon or Beijing. It doesn't matter where I am. People are people, and some people just jump into story, and some people are resistant, but everybody needs help. Mm-hmm. Yeah, everybody needs a little coaxing, and they need a little methodology, say, help me do this because I want to do this.
Mm-hmm. And you just told the story.
I just told the story.
I know you are coming back to Portugal. You will in the future. And I would like you to tell the Portuguese companies who have not worked with you yet, what can they get from the experience? How can you help us being better communicators? And not only that, just telling more stories and influencing more people.
What I bring is the concept of storytelling in business, and I elevate the conversation around it from, I don't understand why I should tell story, to, I think we should tell story, to, oh my gosh, we need to get on board, we need to tell a story. And I bring a methodology. I come into a room and I elevate the conversation. I bring technology, I bring information, I bring templates and systems and procedures. I take people through a experience during the course of the day where they're learning about story, they're choosing story, they're developing story, they're on their feet telling story, they're getting feedback about story. And by the end of the day, the energy has just been so high and everybody's like so understanding. It's like, I can do this. And that's what I bring to the room, is I take people from, I want to, but I don't think I know how, and I'm not very good, to, I can do this. I now have instructions, I now have templates, I now have systems, and I've been validated. I've been told that was a great story. The story that I told was a great story. And so what I bring is a unique and lovely and interactive approach to the process of storytelling. Everybody can be a better storyteller. They just need a little help.
Yeah. Doug, I know we cannot finish this interview without having Doug telling us a story. So what story are you going to tell?
One of the most common challenges leaders have is trying to gain buy-in to a change that's going on in an organization. So I was asked to give a program on change, a keynote on change. And so here's the story that I came up with. His name was Oscar. Oscar was the CEO and founder of a transportation company, and his organization was going through a lot of change, and so they hired me to give a keynote speech on the positive power of change. Now, when I arrived at the event, Oscar introduced himself to me and made it clear to me that he was going to get up and give 10 minutes worth of opening comments, and then I'd get up and I'd be the show. And so I kind of stood back in the background while the meeting began, and they introduced Oscar, and he got up and started speaking to his audience, his employees. And this is how he started out. Well, good morning, everyone. Great to have you all here at the annual meeting. I see that there's a lot of old faces here from many, many years ago, from the beginning of the company, but a lot of new faces. And I hear that there's a lot of grumbling going on about how we would like things to be the way they used to be. Isn't that what you think? You'd like things to be the way they used to be before we had all these changes? Well, let's talk about the way things used to be. A long time ago, we went from mimeograph machines, which many of you don't even remember, to Smith Corona electric typewriters. Do you want to go back to the good old days of electric typewriters before computers? I don't think so. Well, Oscar went on to make a logical case why going back to the good old days before all these changes wasn't such a good idea after all. And I was thinking, this is a logical case. He's making a logical statement. But I don't think he's getting anywhere with this, and so he changed gears. He came back out and continued talking. Now, many of you probably look around the room, those of you who are old-timers, and notice that someone's missing. My wife Ethel. my wife of 48 years. We lost her to the cancer 6 months ago. Now that is not a change that I wanted in my life. That is not something that I anticipated, but change happens. And you know, there's something interesting that happened over the last 6 months. We became very close. Every breakfast, every dinner, all those conversations. And I learned a lot about change in the last 6 months. Change is a lot like breathing. When you stop, you die. So what I'd like you all to do with me during the course of the next couple days is to embrace the changes that are going on in our organization. Embrace the fact that we've got new people coming in, new leadership, new 401ks, new technology, new computers. Embrace all of these changes with me. Don't resist them. Don't wish things could go back to the good old days, because the good old days were not that good after all. Here's what I'd like you all to remember. Keep breathing. Well, I was stunned. I don't know about you, but I was stunned. I had just heard the best speech on change that I'd ever heard. Then I had to come up after him and give my speech, and I did the best that I could with my Positive Power of Change keynote speech, and I had my great stories and I had my great lessons. But I went home that day having learned an empowering lesson about change that I've taken with me throughout my entire life, and I hope you will take this lesson with you as well. Keep breathing. Change is not an event, it is an ongoing and constant process. It will always be happening in your life and in your business. So when you get frustrated, please do this with me. Keep breathing.
See, this is storytelling. This is actually great storytelling. Por isso, agora que terminamos a entrevista com o Doug Stevenson, qualquer questão que tenha, sinta-se à vontade para mandar um e-mail, qualquer dúvida que tenha sobre como é que pode ter o Doug na sua empresa, fale comigo que eu tenho todo o gosto em ajudar. Obrigada, até à próxima.